The emergency room of Harwick General Hospital had seen blood before, but not like this. Not scattered across freshly mopped tiles in wide, dragging arcs, not from shattered medication vials spinning beneath steel-toed boots, not from a nurse's temple where a forearm had connected hard enough to snap her head sideways into a pharmacy counter. 30 seconds. That's how long it took Officer Dale Rourke and his partner to turn a Tuesday afternoon shift into something nobody in that ER would forget for the rest of their careers. The woman they slammed against the counter didn't scream. She didn't beg. She bled quietly, steadied her breathing, and looked at the man holding her wrists like she'd already cataloged exactly 3 ways to make him regret it. Her name was Petra Voss. She was a nurse, and she was about to become the worst mistake this city ever made. If this story already has your heart racing, stay with me until the very end. Hit like, drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The day started the way most bad days do, quietly, without warning, with the particular stillness that fools people into thinking everything is fine. Petra Voss arrived at Harwick General at 6:47 in the morning, 13 minutes before her shift officially began. That was standard for her. She didn't like walking into the middle of things. She preferred to arrive early, check the board, scan the overnight notes, and build her own picture of what she was walking into before anyone handed her a filtered version of it. She was 33 years old, medium height, with dark hair she kept pulled back tight during shifts. Not because the hospital required it, but because loose hair was a liability, and Petra didn't tolerate liabilities. She had a small scar along her left collarbone, partially hidden by her scrub neckline, and another one behind her right ear that her short side-swept layers just barely covered. Both were from the same deployment. Neither had anything to do with medicine. She'd been a combat medic for 6 years before she came back to civilian life. 2 tours overseas, one of which ended with a medevac extraction under active fire, and a commendation she kept in a shoebox under her bed because she didn't know what else to do with it. She didn't talk about the military, not at work, not at the bar down the street where the overnight staff sometimes went after a rough shift. It wasn't a secret, exactly. Her supervisor, Elaine, knew. A few of the older nurses knew. But Petra didn't bring it up, and most people read her quietness as introversion and let it go at that. What they didn't read, because people rarely do, was the precision underneath it. The way she moved through a crowded ER without touching anyone. The way she clocked exits automatically when she walked into a room. The way her eyes tracked the monitors and the doors and the hallway junctions simultaneously, not anxiously, but the way a person tracks those things when they've spent years in environments where missing one detail means someone dies. She set her bag in her locker, number 14, second row from the left in the women's staff room, and pulled on her lanyard. The badge said P. Voss, RN. The photo on it made her look like she was barely tolerating the camera, which was accurate. The morning was unremarkable. 2 cardiac cases, a pediatric asthma flare that resolved faster than expected, a man with a construction nail through his palm who kept insisting he was fine to drive himself home. Petra handled all of it the way she handled everything, methodically, without drama. With a running mental commentary she kept entirely to herself. By midday, the ER had that particular afternoon lull that felt more like held breath than actual calm. Petra was restocking a crash cart at the back of Bay 4 when the automatic doors slid open and Detective Garrison Holt walked in with 2 uniformed officers at his back. She recognized Holt. Everyone on staff did. He came through the ER periodically, sometimes to take a statement from an assault victim, sometimes to follow up on overdoses, sometimes just, it seemed, to make himself visible. He was mid-40s, broad across the chest, with the specific kind of confidence that came from a career spent having the authority to make other people uncomfortable. Petra didn't look up from the cart immediately. She noted his entrance, the direction he was walking, the fact that he hadn't stopped at the front desk to announce himself, and then she returned her attention to the epinephrine tray. It took 11 seconds for her to realize they were walking toward her. Petra Voss, Holt said. She set the syringe down, turned. Detective, need you to come with us. She looked at the 2 officers flanking him, Dale Rourke, who she'd seen around the hospital before without ever liking the way he looked at the female staff, and a younger one she didn't recognize wearing the particular expression of someone who hasn't quite decided yet whether to feel guilty. "What's this about?" she said. "Pharmacy theft," Holt said. "We're going to have a conversation." The room temperature didn't change. The monitors still beeped. Elaine was across the floor talking to a resident, her back turned. Two other nurses were visible further down the hall. Petra's first impulse, and it was a physical thing, reflexive, old, was to assess the room for angles. She overrode it. She was in a hospital. These were police officers with paperwork, presumably. She'd done nothing wrong. "I'm in the middle of a shift," she said. "That's going to have to wait," Rourke said, and there was something in his voice that shouldn't have been there. Something too settled, too prepared, like a man who'd already decided how this scene was going to play out. Petra took that in, filed it. "Let me tell my supervisor," she said. "We're doing this now," Rourke said. She looked at him for a moment without expression. Then she raised her voice just enough to carry. "Elaine." Rourke's hand closed around her forearm. She didn't react. She held still with the specific stillness of someone who has learned that stillness can be a weapon, that it unnerves people in a way that resistance doesn't, that it forces them to escalate or retreat, and that the choice they make tells you everything. Rourke escalated. It happened fast. Later, different people who'd been in the ER would describe it differently depending on where they'd been standing. Some said Petra had resisted. Some said she'd been passive. Some said they hadn't seen how it started. What almost everyone agreed on was the sound. The hard crack of a shoulder connecting with the pharmacy counter, the clatter of a supply tray hitting the floor, the specific silence that follows when something goes wrong that nobody can immediately process. Petra's head hit the counter edge on the way down. Not hard enough to knock her out, but hard enough that the left side of her face was bleeding when she straightened, hard enough that the junior nurse 2 bays down let out an involuntary noise. "Don't make this worse than it is," Rourke said. Petra looked at him. Her expression hadn't changed. There was blood running down along her jaw, and she hadn't raised a hand to touch it. "You have blood on your sleeve," she said quietly. Rourke blinked. He looked down. He did. A smear from where he'd grabbed her. "Get up," he said. She got up. What happened in the next 4 minutes would be talked about in the break room at Harwick General for months. Not because it was the worst thing that had ever happened in that ER, it wasn't, but because of how it was witnessed, how many people saw it, how nobody, in the moment, said a word. Holt recited an accusation that Petra Voss had been systematically stealing controlled substances from the hospital pharmacy over a period of 6 weeks. Oxycodone, fentanyl patches, a specific brand of benzodiazepine used primarily in the ICU. He said it in the tone of a man reading a shopping list, as if the words didn't constitute the destruction of a person's career and reputation while she was still standing in her workplace with blood drying on her cheek. "That's not accurate," Petra said. "We have documentation," Holt said. "Then show it to me." "That's not how this works." Across the room, Elaine had turned around. She was watching, her face a complicated map of reaction, concern, uncertainty, the specific paralysis of someone in an institutional role who doesn't know which institutional response applies. She met Petra's eyes once, then she looked away. That was the thing that landed hardest. Not the counter, not the blood, not even Holt's flat recitation of accusations that bore no relationship to anything Petra had ever done. It was Elaine looking away. Elaine who had hired her. Elaine who had once stayed 20 minutes after a brutal overnight shift just to tell Petra she was doing good work. Elaine looked away, and something in Petra's chest registered it the way you register a structural failure. Not with surprise exactly, but with a grim pre-existing understanding that things were worse than you'd hoped. They walked her out through the main corridor, not the staff corridor, not the back entrance. The main hall, past the waiting room where a family of 4 was watching with open mouths, past the admissions desk, past the volunteer at the information kiosk who literally stood up to see better. Rourke's hand was on her arm the whole time, tight enough to be a statement. Petra kept her chin level and her pace steady. She counted her steps the way she'd been trained to do in situations that required control. 1, 2, 3, 4. A rhythm to occupy the part of the brain that wanted to do something inadvisable. In the parking lot, the afternoon sun was blunt and hot. A news van, she clocked it immediately, was parked at the far end of the lot with its side door open. Too convenient, too already there. They called the press before they made the arrest. The thought arrived cold and clear. This isn't a procedure. This is a production. Otit. The Harwick Police Department's third-floor interview room smelled like burnt coffee and old carpet, and the accumulated anxiety of everyone who'd ever sat in the plastic chair Petra was now sitting in. Holt sat across from her. Rourke stood by the door. A woman in a gray blazer, someone from hospital administration, Petra guessed from the Calverton Health System's lanyard she was trying not to make obvious, sat in the corner like she was hoping to become invisible. There was a document on the table, several pages, dense with language, with a signature line at the bottom. "We're offering you an out," Holt said. "Resign. No charges filed. You sign this, you're done, and you move on." Petra looked at the document without touching it. "What does it say?" "That you acknowledge certain irregularities in your handling of controlled substances and agree to voluntarily separate from Harwick General, effective immediately." "So it says I did something I didn't do." "It says you're separating employment. The language before that says more than that." Holt leaned back in his chair and looked at her with the expression of a man who'd run this play many times and found it reliable. "Ms. Voss, you're 33 years old. You've got a nursing license. Don't make a decision in this room that follows you for the next 30 years. "I appreciate the concern," Petra said, and her voice was entirely flat. "But I'm not signing something false." There was a pause. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," Rourke said from the door. Petra looked at him for a moment. "You knew my locker number," she said. "You walked directly to Bay 4 without asking anyone where I was. You had a news crew in the parking lot before you made an arrest." She paused. "This isn't a drug theft case." Rourke's expression shifted, barely, just a degree, but she caught it. She'd been trained to catch things that moved that small. "Sign the document," Holt said. "No." The woman in this gray blazer made a small noise that wasn't quite a word. "Ms. Voss," Holt said, his voice dropping, "Chief Aldridge has personally reviewed this case. This is not going to go the way you want it to." Petra filed that name, Aldridge. She'd heard it before, not from her time at Harwick General, but from somewhere older. Something that surfaced now from a part of her memory she didn't keep active but had never cleared. "I want to speak with an attorney," she said. Holt stood up. "That's your right, but understand that the moment you lawyer up, our offer goes off the table and we proceed to filing." "Understood," she said. They left her in the room. The woman in the gray blazer lingered a half-second too long before following, and in that half-second she looked at Petra with an expression that wasn't administrative. It was something closer to desperate. Petra sat alone in the room and breathed. In through the nose, 4 counts. Out through the mouth, 4 counts. The same rhythm she'd used once in a ditch outside a forward operating base waiting for fire support, which put this particular situation in useful perspective. She had nothing to hide, which meant the danger wasn't exposure. The danger was the architecture of the lie, how thoroughly it had been built before she ever walked into that ER this morning. That kind of preparation took resources. It took coordination between the police and the hospital. It took someone with enough reach to arrange a news van in a parking lot before the first handcuff was clicked. She thought about Elaine looking away. She thought about the woman in the gray blazer's desperate eyes. She thought about Rourke knowing her locker number. Then she thought about where she'd heard Aldridge before. Her attorney's name was Marcus Webb. She called him from a phone at the booking desk after 2 hours in the interview room and 14 minutes of bureaucratic friction from a desk sergeant who seemed to have been told to make her wait. Webb was 51, compact, with the specific energy of a man who survived on 4 hours of sleep and took genuine personal offense at procedural abuse. He'd handled 2 other cases involving Calverton Health Systems, though he hadn't mentioned this on the phone. Petra found out later. He arrived in 45 minutes and spent 12 of them in a separate room with Holt, before coming to find her in the holding area they'd moved her to when she'd refused to sign. "They want you scared," he said, sitting across from her with a legal pad already open. "That document they showed you, it's not standard separation paperwork. I've seen similar language in 3 cases this year, all involving hospital staff, all involving this precinct." He looked up. "You're not the first." "Tell me about the others," Petra said. 2 nurses and a pharmacist, all accused of controlled substance theft, all pressured to sign documentation, all lost their positions before any of it went to a hearing. He paused. One of them, a woman named Daria Flood, is currently 3 months into a wrongful termination suit with exactly zero momentum because someone keeps misplacing her filings. Petra processed this. What's the benefit to the hospital? You pressure someone out, you still have to explain the missing drugs. There aren't any missing drugs, Webb said. That's the point. The documentation they showed you, inventory logs supposedly signed off by pharmacy staff, I'd bet my license those signatures aren't real. What you're looking at is a system for removing specific employees and replacing them with ones who won't ask questions about certain billing practices. What kind of billing practices? Webb looked at her steadily. ICU patients on extended stays. Certain medication protocols that are, let's say, unusually consistent across a specific patient demographic. Older patients. Patients with limited family oversight. Patients whose insurance coverage makes them particularly valuable to maintain in a certain status. The room was quiet for a moment. Forced treatment, Petra said. Suspected. Nothing proven yet. Petra thought about the ICU floor. The medications Holt had named. The fentanyl patches. The benzodiazepines. Not the drugs you stole to sell. The drugs you used to keep someone compliant and disoriented. I want everything you have on the other cases, she said. I'll send it tonight. Webb closed his pad. Petra, this is a careful operation. They've been running it for a while without significant interference. If you push on this, they already pushed first, she said. He looked at her for a moment. Something shifted in his professional composure. Not much, but enough to suggest that whatever he'd expected when he got this call, it wasn't quite her. There's something else, he said. The arresting officer, Rourke. Before he was on the force here, he was military, Petra said. Webb blinked. Civilian contractor, defense sector, 6 years before he transitioned to law enforcement. He paused. Did you know that already? I know the name, she said. From before. I need to verify something first. She didn't tell him what. Not yet. Because the thing forming in her mind was too specific, too connected to things she wasn't supposed to know anymore. Files she wasn't supposed to still have access to, evidence she'd documented and transferred through channels that had supposedly been sealed when her service ended. Supposedly. They released her on her own recognizance at 9:14 that evening. The charges weren't filed yet. Webb's arrival had slowed that process. But the suspension from Harwick General was already in effect, communicated via a formal email that had hit her account at 4:30 in the afternoon while she was still sitting in the interview room. The media had the story by 6. She checked her phone in the cab home and found 4 news links, 2 of which featured a photograph taken in the hospital parking lot, angled to catch the handcuffs, with captions describing her as a nursing professional under investigation for pharmaceutical theft. One outlet had already found her LinkedIn. Another had contacted a former colleague who'd given a puzzled, carefully non-committal comment that the outlet had managed to make sound like damning confirmation. She read all of it without expression. The cab driver was playing something low and crackling on an AM station. Outside, Harwick's industrial south side moved past the windows. Tire shops, laundromats, the chicken place that had been there since she was a kid. She'd grown up 40 minutes north of here, which wasn't quite the same as being from here, but close enough that the city felt like something recognizable rather than neutral. Her apartment was on the 4th floor of a building that had good bones and bad maintenance, which was a combination she respected because it was honest. She let herself in, locked both deadbolts, which she'd installed herself, because the building's originals were decorative at best, and sat on the floor of her living room in the dark for approximately 4 minutes. Then she got up and went to her closet. The shoebox was under 2 winter coats and a bag of gear she hadn't used since she'd stopped rock climbing 2 years ago. Inside it was the commendation, folded. A photograph she didn't look at. A small external hard drive the size of a deck of playing cards, wrapped in a square of anti-static cloth. She held the drive for a moment. It was still encrypted. It was still functional. She'd tested it 6 months ago out of a habit she couldn't explain to herself except as due diligence. The files on it were not supposed to exist outside of a classified archive. But she'd copied them before she left the service, not because she'd known she'd need them, but because she'd known she might, because she'd watched what happened when documentation didn't survive, when files got lost or sealed or quietly corrected, and she'd made a decision about what kind of person she was going to be. She put the drive on her kitchen table and looked at it. Rourke. The name had been on a secondary appendix in one of those files, connected to a contractor network that had been investigated for procurement irregularities in a theater of operations she'd been deployed to. The investigation had been opened and closed twice. The second closure had come with a notation she'd never been given a satisfying explanation for. The name in that notation, the supervising officer who'd signed off on the closure, was Aldridge. She stood in her kitchen and let that settle. Then she heard the noise. Not loud, not dramatic. A specific kind of sound that didn't belong to the building's usual acoustic vocabulary. A weight distribution on the stairwell landing that was heavier and more deliberate than the neighbors or the usual settlement of the structure. Multiple points of contact. Practice spacing. Petra didn't turn on a light. She moved to the far side of the kitchen counter, below the window line, with the hard drive in her hand, and she thought with a speed and clarity that her civilian life had muffled but never actually erased. She thought about the fire escape. She thought about the building's layout, the alley on the east side, the parking structure 2 blocks north. She thought about who knew her address, the hospital HR system, which was owned by Calverton Health Systems, which was connected to people who were currently very motivated to find out what she knew and how much. The landing outside her door went quiet. That was worse than the noise. She had maybe 30 seconds before they decided waiting wasn't working. She looked at the hard drive in her hand, at everything it represented, the years it had taken to keep it, the career she'd built quietly on top of it, the careful, ordinary life she'd constructed around the things she'd never been able to let go of. Then she thought about Daria Flood, 3 months into a lawsuit going nowhere. She thought about elderly patients in the ICU, disoriented and compliant. She thought about Rourke's hand on her arm and Holt's shopping list voice and Elaine looking away. Her phone was in her back pocket. She had one contact, not in her regular directory, saved under a name that meant nothing to anyone who found the phone, who had given her a number years ago and said, "Use this if you ever find something you can't handle alone, and you'll know when that is." She'd never used it. Her door exploded inward at exactly the same moment she pressed call. The first officer through was fast, flashlight equipped, already calling "clear" before he'd finished entering, and the second was right behind him. Not Rourke, not Holt, different faces. And the apartment was dark, and the kitchen counter was between them and the fire escape window, and Petra was already through it, the cold metal of the grate under her feet, the phone to her ear, the hard drive pressed to her chest. The line connected on the second ring. "Voss?" said a voice she hadn't heard in 4 years. Even through the phone, in the dark, with the sounds of her apartment being entered behind her, it was unmistakably steady. "Tell me where you are." She gave him the address in 9 words and hung up, because the window behind her was already rattling. The fire escape was 4 floors up, and the alley below was dark, and she descended the way she'd been trained to descend things in bad situations, fast, controlled, weight distributed, not looking down. The metal vibrated under her but held. 3rd floor landing, second. The retractable ladder at the bottom hadn't been retracted in what looked like years. Rust had fused it partway down, and she dropped the last 6 feet to the alley floor, landed on the balls of her feet, and kept moving without breaking stride. Behind her, she heard the window above scrape open. She didn't look back. The alley ran east between 2 low commercial buildings. A dumpster, a locked gate, a gap between a loading dock and a fence that was just wide enough if she turned sideways, and she turned sideways without slowing. The gap led her out onto a service road that ran parallel to her street, unlit, with nothing on it but a parked delivery truck and the sound of traffic from the main avenue 2 blocks over. She ran. Not fast enough to attract attention, not the flat-out sprint of someone being chased, which would register wrong at this hour, but the purposeful pace of someone with somewhere to be. Her shoes were the ones she'd been wearing all day, nursing shoes, not ideal, but she'd run in worse. The hard drive was in her left hand, pressed against her ribs. Her phone was in her right. At the corner of Delacroix and 9th, she ducked into the alcove of a closed dry cleaner and stopped to breathe and think. They'd been waiting on her landing, which meant someone had given them her home address quickly, within hours of her release. Calverton Health Systems had her file. HR databases weren't supposed to be accessible to law enforcement without warrants, but she'd already established this afternoon that the operational relationship between this police department and this hospital network didn't have a lot of patience for procedural niceties. She counted her resources. Phone, charged to 61%. The drive. $63 in her wallet. The key to a storage unit on the north side she paid for in cash under a different name, a habit she'd maintained since leaving the service for no reason she'd ever felt the need to justify to herself. She was wearing hospital scrubs with dried blood on the collar. The contact's name was Renata Solis. She had been Petra's commanding officer for the last 18 months of her second tour, a woman who operated with a kind of lateral thinking that Petra had both learned from and occasionally found exhausting because it meant nothing was ever simple when Renata was involved. When Petra had left the service, Renata had stayed. When Renata had eventually left the service, she'd moved into something with a longer title and fewer explanatory details that Petra had not asked about because she'd recognized the category of work. 12 minutes after she'd hung up, her phone buzzed. Corner of Delacroix and 11th. Blue Chevy. Don't stand under the light. Petra looked up. She was at 9th, 2 blocks north. She moved. The Chevy was there. Older model, clean, the kind of car that was deliberately unremarkable, and the passenger window was already down. The woman behind the wheel was 47, silver-streaked hair cut short, wearing a jacket that was slightly too large for her in a way that had nothing to do with fit and everything to do with what it was concealing. Renata Solis looked at her for about a second and a half, taking in the dried blood on her collar, the scrubs, the hard drive clutched to her chest. "Get in," she said. Petra got in. They drove for 4 minutes without speaking, which was about right given that Renata needed to clear the area and run a basic surveillance check and Petra needed to get her breathing back to operational. The city moved past the windows, late traffic, neon signs, the ordinary machinery of a Tuesday night that had no idea what it was adjacent to. "How bad?" Renata said finally. "They've been doing it to others," Petra said. "At least 3 before me that I know of. Webb thinks it's about billing fraud and forced patient maintenance. ICU patients, specific demographics." She paused. "The arresting officer is Dale Rourke. Before he was a cop, he was a contractor. His name is in the appendix files from the Castle procurement investigation." The car didn't swerve. Renata's expression didn't change, but her hands tightened slightly on the wheel, and Petra read that the same way she'd read Rourke's micro-expression earlier, not as emotion, but as information. "You have the drive," Renata said. It wasn't a question. "Yes. With you, right now." "Yes." Renata exhaled through her nose. "You've been sitting on documentation tied to a classified investigation for 4 years, and you didn't—" She stopped, started over. "I'm not surprised. I'm not even particularly angry. I just want to note, for the record, that you have a talent for accumulating situations." "They came to my apartment," Petra said. "Tonight, after I was released. That's not a police investigation. That's suppression." "I know what it is." Renata turned onto a highway on-ramp heading north. "I need to make a call when we stop. There are people who have been looking for the operational thread that connects the Castle case to current activity. If your drive has what you think it has, and if there's a provable link to this police chief—" "Aldridge," Petra said. "His name is in the closure notation on the second Castle inquiry." The silence that followed was longer than the previous ones. "Say that again," Renata said. "The second closure of the Castle procurement investigation, the supervising officer who signed off. The notation is in Appendix 7. Petra looked at her. "That's the same name as the current chief of police at Harwick PD." Renata drove for another 30 seconds without speaking. Then she said, "Okay." Just that. But the way she said it, quiet, final, the tone of someone who has just confirmed a calculation they'd been running for a long time, told Petra that she had just handed Renata something she'd been looking for. But they stopped at a motel off the interstate that accepted cash and didn't ask for ID. If you knew how to make the request correctly, which Renata did. She paid for 2 rooms, got 2 keys, and handed Petra one with the instructions to stay off her phone and away from the window and eat something from the vending machines because she looked like hell. You need a doctor, Renata added, nodding at Petra's temple, where the cut had dried into a crust along her hairline. I've had worse. That's not the medical standard I'm using. Petra examined the wound in the bathroom mirror. Not deep, didn't need stitches, would leave a bruise that would look impressive in the morning. She cleaned it with water and a piece of rough motel towel and told herself it was fine, which it was, mostly. She didn't sleep. She sat on the edge of the bed and thought. The thing about having a military background that civilians rarely understood was that it didn't make you brave, exactly, or not just brave. It made you systematic. It gave you a framework for processing scenarios in which you had limited control and high stakes, because you'd been in enough of them that the cognitive template existed, and you could slot current information into it without the particular brand of spiral that overtook people who were encountering genuine danger for the first time. What she knew, the drug theft accusation, was fabricated. The documentation Holt had shown her, inventory logs, supposed evidence, had been created by someone with access to hospital pharmacy records, which meant someone inside Calverton Health Systems. The pressure to sign the resignation agreement was designed to produce a documented admission that could be used to suppress any future legal action. The timing of the news van meant coordination between the department and either the hospital or a third party. The apartment entry was illegal, warrantless, and fast, which meant Chief Aldridge had either authorized it directly or created a culture in which authorization wasn't considered necessary. What she suspected, the patient treatment scheme Webb had described, wasn't incidental. It was the core. The nurse removals, Daria Flood, the others, now her, were maintenance operations, eliminating staff who were positioned to notice anomalies in patient medication records, which meant somewhere in Harwick General's ICU, there were patients being kept in a prolonged medical state they hadn't consented to, and someone was billing for it, and the billing was going somewhere. What she didn't know yet, the shape of the financial network, the full scope of how many people were inside it, whether the evidence she'd preserved from 4 years ago was still legally viable, and the question that kept surfacing, whether the woman in the gray blazer, the one from the hospital administration who'd sat in the corner of the interview room with her desperate eyes, was a participant or a witness. She thought about that woman's expression for a long time. Petra had made a career, both military and civilian, out of reading people under pressure. Fear presented differently than complicity. The woman in the gray blazer had looked afraid, not the tactical, managed fear of someone protecting themselves in a known operation, but the specific raw fear of someone who had walked into something they hadn't fully understood and couldn't find the exit. She filed it as a potential resource. At 3 a.m., she heard a knock on the wall between her room and Renata's. 2 knocks. Pause. 1, which was an old signal that meant, I need you. She was through the connecting door in seconds. Renata was sitting at the small desk with a laptop open and the hard drive plugged into an adapter, and on the screen were documents that Petra recognized. The Castle appendices, the procurement records, the contractor network mapping that had taken 3 months of her deployment to compile. Sitting across from Renata, face lit by the screen, was a man Petra didn't recognize. Late 30s, lean, with the kind of careful blankness that suggested active effort to be unreadable. This is Declan Marsh, Renata said, not looking up from the screen. He works with a federal task force that has been running an active investigation into Calverton Health Systems for 14 months. Petra looked at Declan Marsh. He looked back with professional neutrality. What kind of task force? She said. Healthcare fraud and organized criminal enterprise, he said. His voice was measured. Maryland accent, she thought, or somewhere close. We've been building a financial picture. What we've been missing is the connective tissue between the civil administrative layer, the hospital board, the billing operations, and the law enforcement protection network. He nodded toward the screen. If what's on this drive is authenticated, you've just handed us the connective tissue. It'll authenticate, Petra said. I documented provenance at every stage. He looked at her steadily. You were a combat medic who spent her deployment building evidentiary documentation of a contractor procurement scheme. The patients were dying from equipment failures that should have been caught in procurement inspections, she said. The contractor falsified the inspection records. People I worked with died. I documented it. And then you kept it. The investigation got closed twice, she said. So yes, I kept it. Something moved behind his professional neutrality. Not quite respect, but something adjacent. Ms. Voss, just Petra. The material on this drive, we can't use it officially without running it through authentication channels, which takes time. What we can do tonight is cross-reference it against our existing financial mapping and see if we can establish independent corroboration that doesn't require the drive as primary evidence. He looked back at the screen. If the links hold up against our data, we move to a formal evidentiary request by morning. How long does that take? Depends on what we find. He paused. We have a federal judge on call for exactly this kind of overnight request. If the corroboration is solid, hours, not days. Petra sat down in the chair against the wall, the only other one in the room, and looked at the screen. It was strange seeing those files again. She'd looked at them 6 months ago when she'd run the functionality test, but that had been clinical, just verifying data integrity, numbers, and formats. Now, in this small room in the middle of the night, with everything that had happened today sitting fresh on top of it, the documents looked different. They looked like what they were. Years of careful work, careful risk, careful preservation of something that the people who'd built the scheme had been certain would disappear. Some wounds don't heal until the truth survives. She'd thought that once, quietly, on a transport flight back from her last deployment, looking at the drive in her hand. She'd never said it out loud. "There's a woman," Petra said. "Hospital administration. Calverton Health System's lanyard. She was in the interview room when they tried to get me to sign. She looked scared in a way that wasn't—" She stopped, finding the right words. It wasn't the fear of someone who knew the operation and was worried about exposure. It was the fear of someone who was in the room because someone had told her to be there and she didn't fully know why. Declan looked up. "I need to find out who she is," Petra said. "Why?" "Because frightened witnesses who feel trapped in something make decisions when they think there's an exit. And if she's mid-level administration with access to the billing records, she could corroborate the financial scheme from the inside," Declan finished. "Yes." He looked at Renata, who looked back at him in the way of two people who've worked together long enough to communicate without words. "I'll run the description through our Calverton org chart," he said. "Give me specifics." By morning, 2 things had happened that Petra hadn't anticipated. The first was the video. She found out about it at 7 a.m. through a text from Marcus Webb that contained a link and the message, "This is already at 200,000 views, don't talk to media yet." The video was 43 seconds long, shaky, vertical format, shot from the nursing station opposite Bay 4 on a personal phone. You could see the moment Rourke's hand closed around Petra's arm. You could see her still, controlled posture. You could see the deliberate force with which he drove her into the counter, and the angle was clear enough that there was no reasonable interpretation of it as a response to resistance, because she hadn't moved. The cut on her temple from the counter edge was visible in the last seconds of the footage, along with the spreading silence in the ER as the people around her processed what they'd just seen. Whoever had filmed it had posted it without her knowledge or permission. She didn't know who it was. She found out later it was a second-year resident named Tobias Anand, who had been standing at the station pretending to enter chart notes when the arrest began and who had pressed record on instinct and then sat on the footage for 3 hours before deciding he didn't want to sit on it anymore. She watched the video once, then she put her phone down and breathed. It was both better and worse than she'd imagined. Better because it existed, because it was irrefutable, because the comment section was already doing things that public outrage does when footage is sufficiently clear. Naming Rourke, demanding accountability, the particular velocity of attention that comes from a visual record of something that wasn't supposed to be seen. Worse because her face was in it, bleeding, and it would be the first thing anyone found when they searched her name for the next several years, and she hadn't chosen it, and she didn't like not choosing things. She called Webb. "Tell me what I need to do," she said. "Right now? Nothing." His voice had a different quality than it had yesterday, less steadying, more galvanized. "The department is already in reactive mode. I've had 2 calls this morning from Calverton's internal legal team, which tells me they're worried about the liability exposure if the video connects to the arrest documentation." He paused. "The charges haven't been formally filed yet. As of this morning, there's a procedural delay that wasn't there yesterday, and I think we both know why." They're recalibrating, she said. Fast, which means we need to move faster. He paused again. What aren't you telling me, Petra? Because the way you're not saying things has a very specific shape. She thought about Declan Marsh, about the task force, about the drive. I'm working on something, she said. I need 24 hours. I need to know if there are aspects of this case that could become legally complicated for my ability to represent you. There are aspects of this case that are going to be complicated for a lot of people, she said. None of them are you. A pause. That's not quite the reassurance format I was looking for. I know, give me 24 hours. He gave her 24 hours, but his tone suggested he was giving it under protest. The second thing that happened was the woman from the gray blazer. Her name, according to Declan's org chart cross-reference, was Sandra Copy. She was 41, a compliance and risk manager for Calverton Health System's Harwick region. Exactly the level of middle administration that would be sent to sit in a corner during a sensitive personnel action without necessarily being told why. She had been with Calverton for 6 years, which meant she'd been there long enough to have seen things. Declan had pulled her contact information. Renata had run a preliminary profile. No criminal history, no significant financial irregularities in her personal records. One flag, a complaint she'd filed internally 14 months ago about discrepancies in ICU billing codes that had been closed by her supervisor without a formal response. She'd filed a complaint about billing discrepancies 14 months ago, and it had gone nowhere. Petra looked at that piece of information for a long time. She already tried, she said. Renata looked up from her laptop. Tried what? To flag it, internally, 14 months ago. Petra set the page down. That's not someone who's complicit. That's someone who tried the right channels, got buried, and has been sitting on it since, probably terrified, probably wondering whether trying again would just get her what happened to Daria Flood. She paused. She was in that interview room because they put her there, and she was looking at me like… She stopped, like she wanted to say something and couldn't figure out if I was safe to say it to. We approach her carefully, Declan said. If she's been sitting on internal knowledge for over a year and she's afraid, I approach her, Petra said. Both Declan and Renata looked at her. I'm the person she was looking at in that room, Petra said. I'm not law enforcement. I'm the woman who was just dragged out of her hospital in handcuffs, and whose face is currently on every news feed in this city. She needs to understand that she's not alone in this. Not from a task force agent, not from a federal framework, from someone who's already been through the machine and is still standing. She looked at Declan steadily. You get your interview after I've talked to her, not before. The negotiation took 4 minutes. She won it. Sandra Koppe lived in a duplex in Harwick's East Residential District, beige siding and a small porch that hadn't been touched since the previous summer, given the state of the potted plants. Petra found her at 10:30 in the morning, pulling her mail from the box at the end of her driveway, still in work clothes. Blazer, but a different one, charcoal rather than gray, which suggested she'd been planning to go in and then hadn't. Ms. Koppa, Petra said from the sidewalk. Sandra Koppe turned around and went completely still. She was medium height, brown hair, and a functional cut, with the specific kind of exhaustion in her face that came from carrying something heavy for too long. She looked at Petra's bruised temple, at the civilian clothes that were a slight fit error because they were Renata's, at Petra herself. Her grip on the mail tightened. I shouldn't, she started. I know, Petra said. I'm not here to pressure you. I just want to talk. If someone sees you here, then they see 2 women talking on a sidewalk. Petra kept her voice even. You filed an internal complaint about ICU billing discrepancies 14 months ago. It got closed without a formal response. Sandra's mouth opened slightly. I know you didn't come to that interview room because you wanted to, Petra continued. I know what your expression looked like when you were sitting in that corner, and I know that whatever you were hoping to say to me in those last 2 seconds before you followed them out, you've been carrying something like it for a long time. She paused. I'm not recording this. I'm not wired. I came here by myself. I came here because I think you know what they're doing to those patients, and I think you've been trying to figure out what to do about it since before they ever put my face on the news. The mail was crumpling slightly in Sandra's hand. If I talk to anyone, I know people who can protect you, Petra said. Legally, formally, with actual teeth. Not hospital internal channels. Federal teeth. She held Sandra's gaze. You tried the right way once and it got buried. There are other ways. The silence lasted 8 seconds. Petra counted. The billing codes, Sandra said finally, barely above street noise. The ICU patients, certain patients, not all of them, they're being maintained on protocols that aren't in the clinical record. The medications being used, the duration, it shouldn't look the way it looks for that patient profile. And the billing, she stopped, pressed her lips together. It's being submitted to 3 insurance categories simultaneously for the same patient stays. I noticed it on a quarterly reconciliation. Her voice was unsteady. I built a file. Before I filed the complaint, I kept a copy. Where is it? Petra said. Sandra looked at her for a long moment, the particular look of someone deciding whether the cost of trust is worth it. Inside, she said. The file was on a USB stick taped to the inside back cover of a cookery book on Sandra's kitchen shelf, a hiding spot so domestic it was almost brilliant in its banality. Petra didn't handle the drive. She let Sandra hold it and talk her through what was on it. 14 months of quarterly billing anomalies, a cross-reference list of 43 ICU patients flagged as probable cases, medication logs that Sandra had photographed on her personal phone because she hadn't trusted the system with the digital versions, and 3 emails from her supervisor, Howard Leahy, shutting down the complaint with language that was just careful enough to be deniable but not careful enough to be innocent. Petra listened to all of it. She asked 3 questions. She didn't interrupt. When Sandra finished, she looked up from the USB stick in her hands and said, "They're going to know I talked to you." "Not yet," Petra said. "And when they do, it won't matter, because by then it'll be out of your hands and mine." "You sound very sure of that." Petra thought about Renata in the motel room, about Declan and his federal framework, about the drive in her own pocket, about Tobias Anand's 43-second video sitting at 200,000 views and climbing. She thought about the network of accumulated evidence that was currently converging from different directions onto the same set of people, none of whom knew yet how many angles they were being approached from. "I'm not sure of much," she said, "but I've been in situations where the math started moving in one direction and then it switched. This feels like a switch." Sandra looked at her, not quite convinced, but something softer than fear. "They did a number on you yesterday," she said. "The way they walked you out, I couldn't." "I know," Petra said. "It's okay. I wanted to say something." "You're saying it now," Petra said. "That's what matters." She photographed the key documents from Sandra's file, with Sandra's permission, on Declan's encrypted device that Renata had handed her before she'd left the motel, and she left Sandra Coppa standing in her kitchen holding a USB stick that was about to become the most important piece of her own protection. She told her not to go into work. She told her not to make unusual calls. She told her that someone would be in contact within hours, and that the contact would identify themselves with a specific phrase she gave her, and that Sandra should respond to no one else. She walked back to Renata's car, which was idling half a block away, and got in and said, "We have the billing records." Renata pulled into traffic. "How solid?" "Solid enough. Sandra Coppa is not a federal witness yet, but she will be by tomorrow if Declan's team moves right." She paused. "And she's been sitting on this for over a year. She's frightened, but she's not fragile. She documented everything before she reported it internally. She's the kind of person who builds a backup." She looked out the window at the passing street. "She needs protection. Declan can arrange—" "Today," Petra said. "Not tomorrow. Today." Renata's jaw tightened. "I'll make the call." They drove in silence for a moment. "The video's at 400,000 now," Renata said. It sounded almost conversational. "I know." "The Harwick PD communications team released a statement this morning. They said you resisted arrest." "The video says otherwise." "The video is being contested by their union rep, who says it lacks sufficient context." Renata's voice was dry. "Which is the kind of statement that sounds substantial until you watch the video." Petra didn't respond. "There are reporters calling Webb's office," Renata continued. 3 local, 2 national. One of them is specifically asking about your military background. Someone found your deployment records, or a portion of them. That landed slightly differently than expected. Which portion? The commendation. The circumstances are partly public record, combat medic, extraction under fire, civilian casualties minimized. Renata glanced at her. The specific citation mentions exceptional calm under conditions of, I know what the citation says, Petra said. Renata let that sit. Outside, the city moved past in the ordinary mid-morning way, people walking, storefronts opening, a school bus waiting at a light. The infrastructure of a normal day surrounding something that was anything but. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She looked at Renata. Answer it, Renata said. I'm recording from my end. She answered. The voice was male, older, with the particular practiced authority of someone who'd spent decades behind institutional power. Not Holt, not Rourke. She'd never heard this voice before in person, but she'd spent enough time last night looking at the castle files to have built a mental architecture around it. Ms. Voss, he said, I think we should meet. She didn't respond for a beat. This is Chief Aldridge, he said. And then, as if it were a courtesy and not the most threatening sentence he could have opened with, I want to help you resolve this situation. The car moved through an intersection. Petra looked straight ahead at the road. I appreciate that, she said, keeping her voice entirely neutral. I know this has been a difficult day. I want you to know that I've reviewed your case personally, and there may have been procedural irregularities on our end that I want to address directly. A pause. This doesn't need to escalate. There are ways to handle this quietly that benefit everyone. He was offering her a deal. He was doing it because the video had gone viral, because the PR math had shifted, because someone had calculated that the cleanest solution was to buy her off before the situation became uncontainable. He was doing it confidently, which meant he didn't know yet about Declan's task force. He didn't know about the drive. He didn't know about Sandra Kappa, which meant he still thought he was the one with all the cards. I'm listening, Petra said. Good. She could hear the satisfaction in his voice, the particular satisfaction of a man who's had the same strategy work so many times that the familiarity of it feels like control. I'd like to meet this afternoon, somewhere neutral, just us. She looked at Renata, who was looking back at her with the expression of someone watching a chessboard. I can do that, Petra said. There's a place called the Hartwell Room at the Bell End Hotel downtown, 3 o'clock. I'll be there, she said. She ended the call. The car was quiet for a full 3 seconds. He doesn't know, Renata said. No. He thinks this is still containable. Yes. Renata was quiet for another moment, then, You're going to meet him. We're going to meet him, Petra said. Declan needs to know. I want everything operational by 2 o'clock. She looked down at the phone in her hand. If Aldridge is willing to negotiate in person before the charges are formally filed, it means he's worried. Worried people make mistakes. She paused. And I want to be in the room when he makes his. Renata said nothing for a moment. Then she made the call to Declan. While she was on the phone, Petra looked out the window at Harwick moving past. This city she'd grown up adjacent to, this city she'd come back to after the war, this city that had spent yesterday publicly destroying her. She looked at it without bitterness, which surprised her slightly. What she felt instead was something colder and more specific, the focused clarity of someone who has been handed, by accident or design, a set of coordinates on a target they've been waiting to name for a long time. At the next red light, Renata lowered the phone from her ear and said, Declan says yes. He also says, she paused. He found a 4th employee who was forced out of Harwick General under identical circumstances 8 months ago, a pharmacist named Curtis Dial. He's been living in another state for 8 months because they threatened his family. Petra absorbed this. And the video, Renata added, is at 900,000. The light changed. They moved. Petra didn't say anything. She looked at the drive in her pocket and thought about 3 o'clock, about a man who had spent years signing closures and calling in favors and building a network that operated behind the ordinary institutional furniture of a city's public life, a hospital, a police department, a health system, and who believed this morning that he was still in control of the situation. She thought about what he was going to look like when he wasn't. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a number she recognized, Tobias Anand's number, which Webb had sent her after identifying the video's source. She stared at it for a second, surprised he was reaching out directly. She answered, "Miss Voss?" His voice was young and slightly unsteady in the way of someone who has done something significant and is waiting to find out whether it was brave or just reckless. "I'm the one who filmed. I wanted to make sure you knew it wasn't. I should have asked and I didn't, and I'm sorry if—" "Don't apologize," she said. "What you did mattered." A pause. "There's something else. I don't know if it's important." He hesitated. "The morning of your arrest, before you came in, there were 2 men in the hospital I didn't recognize. Not staff, not patients. They were in the corridor near pharmacy for about 20 minutes. I noticed them because one of them went through the staff entrance without badging in." Petra went still. "I have them on my phone," Tobias said. "I took a picture because I was going to report it to security, but then everything—" He stopped. "I still have it." She looked at Renata. "Send it to me," she said into the phone. "Right now." The image came through 15 seconds later. She looked at it. Both men were partially turned away from the camera. One was unidentifiable. The other, slightly clearer, was turned enough that she could see the line of his jaw, the build, the particular way he stood with his weight slightly forward. She knew that stance. She'd been cataloging it since she was 26 years old in a forward operating base, being briefed on contractor personnel. She knew who it was before she looked at the face clearly. "Renata," she said. Renata looked over. Petra held up the phone. For the first time since she'd gotten into this car, Renata's composure showed a crack. Just one. Just for a second. "That's not possible," Renata said. "He's supposed to be in federal custody. That asset forfeiture case, they seized his accounts. He was—" She stopped. "He should be. He was in my hospital yesterday morning," Petra said, "planting evidence." The car was quiet. "And he has a meeting with Chief Aldridge scheduled in 45 minutes, Declan said from Renata's phone, which was still on speaker on the dash. And both women realized he'd been listening to the entire last exchange. His voice had changed. The measured professional neutrality was gone, replaced by something tighter and more urgent that Petra hadn't heard from him before. "Petra," he said, "that man's name is Victor Crane. He's been on our watch list for 2 years. If he's in Harwick, this operation is significantly larger than our financial model projected." A pause. "And if he and Aldridge are meeting in 45 minutes, then Aldridge isn't just a protected official," Petra said. "He's active." "Yes." Declan's voice was precise and controlled, but underneath it something was moving fast. "And Petra, if Crane knows you have the drive, he doesn't know what I have. He will by the time Aldridge talks to him." She looked at the drive. "How fast can you move?" she said. "I need 2 hours to coordinate," Declan said. "Maybe less." "You have 90 minutes, she said. The call went quiet for 3 seconds. Then Declan said something she didn't hear, to someone she couldn't see, and in the background there was the sound of multiple voices activating at once, the particular organized scramble of people shifting from preparation to execution. Renata put both hands on the wheel and drove faster. 90 minutes was not enough time, and everyone in the car knew it. Declan worked the phone from the motel room while Renata drove back, burning through contacts with the compressed efficiency of someone calling in debts accumulated over years. Petra sat in the passenger seat and listened and built the operational picture in her head. Who was moving? Where? How fast? What they needed before 3 o'clock that they didn't currently have. The Crane problem changed everything. A man under federal asset forfeiture who was supposedly contained, showing up in Harwick General's pharmacy corridor the morning of a fabricated arrest. That wasn't a coincidence, and it wasn't improvisation. That was a pre-planned operation running through channels that Declan's 14-month financial investigation had been mapping from the outside without knowing what was at the center. The financial fraud, the patient scheme, the corrupt police infrastructure, those weren't parallel operations. They were layers. And Crane was deeper than any of them. She needed to know how deep before she walked into the Bell End Hotel. "What's Crane's background?" she said when Renata ended a call. "Defense sector. Logistics and supply chain officially. Unofficially, procurement irregularities across 3 theaters, 2 dismissed investigations, 1 sealed grand jury proceeding that got sealed very quickly by a judge who retired 6 months later. Renata glanced at her. He surfaces where institutions are vulnerable. Military contracts, healthcare systems, municipal infrastructure. Anywhere there's federal money flowing through a network of smaller intermediaries that nobody's watching closely enough. He was in Castle, Petra said. His company was a subcontractor. He may not have been present. His name is in the appendix under direct oversight of the inspection falsification. He was present. Petra looked at her hands. I just didn't have a face to put on it until 20 minutes ago. Renata was quiet for a moment. This is going to complicate the federal request timeline. Tell Declan he needs to pull the asset forfeiture monitoring first. If Crane is physically in Harwick while supposedly under financial restriction, there's a compliance failure somewhere in the supervision chain. That's immediate leverage for emergency judicial authorization. She paused. He knows that. He's already doing it, Renata said. But Petra, the meeting at 3. If Aldridge is expecting to negotiate a quiet settlement, and instead Crane shows up, then I need to be in that room before Crane does, Petra said. The calculation was simple and unpleasant. Aldridge had called her expecting a frightened woman looking for an exit. He didn't know about the drive, didn't know about Declan, didn't know that his network was being approached from multiple angles simultaneously. That ignorance was the only advantage she had going into a hotel meeting room with a sitting police chief. The moment Crane briefed him on who she was, what she'd carried out of her deployment, what she'd potentially preserved, the ignorance would collapse, and so would the advantage. She had to get to Aldridge before 3 o'clock, which meant she had to move the meeting. She called him back at 11:47. Chief Aldridge, I appreciate the offer, but I have a complication. She kept her voice uncertain, not panicked, just stressed, the voice of a woman who was in over her head and looking for solid ground. My attorney is insisting on being present for any conversation. He's available at 1:30, not 3. A pause on the line. She heard him thinking. 1:30? He said. Same location. Thank you, she said. I really just want this to be over. She ended the call and looked at Renata. 1:30, she said. Tell Declan. Bopam. The Bell End Hotel's Hartwell room was a private meeting space off the main lobby. Mahogany table, 8 chairs, a window overlooking a side street that was currently empty. Petra arrived at 1:15. She was wearing clothes Renata had sourced from somewhere, dark slacks, a plain gray top, nothing that signaled what she was, nothing that signaled what she knew. The bruise on her temple had settled into something impressively visible. She didn't cover it. Marcus Webb was with her, which was real. She'd called him on the way and given him just enough to bring him without briefing him completely, which he'd accepted with the particular controlled frustration of a lawyer who knew when not to ask questions. He was carrying a legal pad and wearing the expression of a man entering a room prepared to be lied to. Declan was not in the room. Declan was in a vehicle 2 blocks from the hotel with 3 members of his task force and a federal warrant application that was 90% complete, waiting on 1 authentication confirmation that was still processing through a lab that had been woken up at 6 a.m. for this purpose. Renata was elsewhere. She'd told Petra where, but Petra kept that information behind a door in her mind that she didn't open in situations where her face needed to stay neutral. Aldridge arrived at 1:28. He was 62 years old, heavy through the shoulders, with white hair and the kind of face that had been designed by decades of institutional authority into a permanent expression of reasonable expectation. He came with a lawyer, a private one, not a department attorney, which told Petra something about how separately he was running this from official channels, and without Holt, without Rourke, without anyone from the department. He looked at her bruised temple when he sat down. His expression registered it and filed it without visible reaction, which was the reaction of a man who'd made his peace with consequences he hadn't personally administered. Ms. Voss, he said, I'm glad you were willing to meet. I want this resolved, she said, which was true in a way he wouldn't understand until later. I think we can do that. He nodded toward his attorney, who placed a document folder on the table. What we're proposing is straightforward. The department withdraws the pending charges. Your employment record is cleared of any reference to this incident. In exchange, you sign a non-disclosure agreement covering the details of yesterday's events, and you agree to have no further professional contact with Harwick General or the Calverton Health Systems Network. Petra looked at the folder. That's a broad NDA. Broad but fair, he said. You walk away clean. Your license is intact. Your record is clean, and you have full liberty to continue your career elsewhere. He paused. This situation was unfortunate. I won't pretend otherwise, but escalating it serves no one. Webb was writing on his legal pad with the systematic attention of a man who would later reconstruct this conversation from memory for a judge. The other employees, Petra said. Daria Flood, the pharmacist. The others who went through the same process. Aldridge's expression shifted slightly. A recalibration. He hadn't expected her to name them. Those are separate matters, he said. Are they? Ms. Voss. His voice dropped in the specific way of someone used to using weight as an argument. I'm trying to give you an exit. Take it. I'd like to review the document before I respond, she said. The attorney slid the folder across the table. Webb took it. Petra didn't touch it. Her phone was face down on the table. Under the table, her hand was steady. She'd measured the last 40 minutes in increments, each one buying Declan time, each one keeping Aldridge in a room where he wasn't being briefed by Victor Crane, each one moving the warrant application closer to completion. She had pushed the meeting forward by 90 minutes. Crane's meeting with Aldridge had been scheduled for the original 3 o'clock slot, which meant she had bought roughly 90 minutes before Crane arrived at wherever they were supposed to meet and found Aldridge unreachable. Assuming Crane didn't reach him first by phone, assuming the warrant cleared, assuming the lab confirmed the drive authentication. She had a lot of assumptions and a table she needed to stay at. The language here is unusually broad, Webb said without looking up from the document. Subsection 4C extends the NDA to... His phone buzzed. He glanced at it, and something happened in his face. A small, controlled recalibration that only someone watching for it would catch. He looked at Petra. I need a moment with my client. Aldridge looked between them. We've just started... 5 minutes, Webb said pleasantly, already standing. They stepped into the corridor outside the Hartwell room. Webb pulled the door closed and then turned to her and spoke very quietly. Declan Marsh just sent me a single text, he said. It says, warrant cleared 15 minutes. Keep him in the room. Petra exhaled. Just one breath. Then she nodded. What do you need from me? Webb said. His voice was professional and steady, and underneath it she could hear the specific vibration of someone who had just understood the scale of what they were standing inside. Go back in there, she said. Find issues with the NDA. Real issues. There are plenty. Ask for clarification on every subsection. Don't let him leave. And you? I'll be right behind you. She pulled out her phone and sent Declan one word. Confirmed. Then she took a breath and walked back into the room and sat down across from a man who had spent his career making problems disappear and who did not yet know that he had just become one. The 15 minutes were the longest of the morning. Webb was good. He was genuinely professionally good in the way of someone who'd spent 20 years finding the fault lines in documents, and the NDA had enough of them that his questions were substantive rather than manufactured. Aldridge's attorney answered some and deflected others, and twice looked at Aldridge with the expression of a lawyer who had not been given complete information. Aldridge himself became progressively less relaxed. Not visibly, he was too experienced for visible agitation, but the quality of his stillness changed. It became the stillness of a man who was tracking more than one thread and beginning to feel them pulling in different directions. At minute 11, his phone buzzed. He glanced at it under the table. She saw the movement, and whatever he read made his stillness change again, this time in a direction she recognized. Awareness. The awareness of a man who has just realized the terrain has shifted. He looked at her. She held his gaze and gave him nothing. His phone buzzed again. He ignored it this time, which was worse. It meant he already knew what it was saying and was choosing to stay in this room anyway, which meant he was thinking, calculating, looking for a variable he could still control. He was looking at her. Ms. Voss, he said, cutting across Webb's current question about subsection 7A. Let me be direct. Please, she said, you came to this meeting knowing more than you've disclosed. I'd like to understand what you actually want. It was a pivot, a professional one. He was abandoning the settlement frame and shifting to negotiation, which meant he sensed the settlement was no longer viable and was trying to find out what she'd take before things moved outside his reach. It was also, she recognized, a kind of respect, the grudging acknowledgement that the person across the table was not what he'd assumed when he made the phone call that morning. She leaned forward slightly. "I want the charges against me dropped," she said. "I want Daria Flood's lawsuit unblocked. I want Curtis Dial to be able to come back to this city without fear. I want the patients in Harwick General's ICU to have their actual medical records reviewed by an independent clinical board." She paused. "And I want the people responsible for building this system to answer for it in a place where your signature doesn't make things disappear." The room was very quiet. Aldridge looked at her for a long moment. His attorney started to speak. The door opened. Declan Marsh walked in, followed by two people Petra didn't know, but recognized by the way they moved and the credentials they were already presenting. Webb stood up. Aldridge's attorney stood up. Aldridge himself remained seated, and in the single second before his face reorganized itself into the composure he'd maintained for 30 years of institutional authority, Petra saw the thing underneath it. Not fear, not yet, but the specific look of a man watching a structure he built with his own hands begin to come apart. "Chief Aldridge," Declan said. His voice was entirely level. "Declan Marsh, Federal Task Force on Healthcare Fraud and Organized Criminal Enterprise. I have a federal warrant covering the seizure of records related to Calverton Health System's billing operations, Harwick Police Department's internal communications on a specific case list I'll provide now, and the activities of Victor Crane within the jurisdiction of—" "I want my attorney," Aldridge said. His voice was steady. Whatever else he was steady. "Your private attorney is present. You're welcome to consult him." Declan set a document on the table. "You should also know that as of 37 minutes ago, Victor Crane was detained at Harwick Municipal Airport, attempting to board a connecting flight to Montreal. He is currently in federal custody." Something moved across Aldridge's face. Something that had been carefully managed for decades broke just slightly along a fault line. Not enough for someone who didn't know what they were looking at, but enough for Petra, who had been watching faces under pressure since before she could name what she was doing. He looked at her. She didn't look away. "You kept it," he said. Not to Declan, to her. "The castle documentation. You kept it all this time." "Some things are worth keeping," she said. What followed was controlled and procedural in the way that things become controlled and procedural when federal authority finally lands on a situation that has been operating outside accountability for years. Aldridge was not arrested in the Hartwell room. The warrant at that stage was for records, not persons, and Declan was precise about process in a way that Petra found she respected, even as it frustrated her. But the atmosphere in the room changed in a way that was irreversible, and Aldridge's attorney pulled him out within 6 minutes for a conversation that would end, Petra knew, with a discussion about cooperation. Webb found her in the corridor afterward. He looked like a man who had walked into a room expecting a difficult negotiation and found himself standing in the middle of a historical event. "How long have you been building toward this?" he said. "I haven't," she said honestly. "It came toward me." He looked at her for a moment. "The NDA they wanted you to sign. Subsection 9, it would have covered the castle material, specifically, without naming it." He paused. "They knew about the drive." "Crane knew," she said. "He's been looking for it." "For 4 years?" "He didn't know who had it, just that it existed." She thought about that for a moment. 4 years of carrying something without knowing what it was pointed at. 4 years of due diligence dressed up as habit. "He found me when I became visible." Webb shook his head slowly. Not in disbelief. In the particular way of someone recalculating the size of a thing they'd agreed to be part of. Declan appeared in the corridor and looked at Petra. "We need you," he said. "The warrant covers records, but the authentication of the drive has to be documented by you directly. Provenance chain, acquisition circumstances. Can you do that now?" "Yes," she said. She followed him. The next 4 hours were the most procedurally intense of Petra's life, which was a statement that competed against some significant entries. She sat in a federal field office that operated out of a building in Harwick's financial district, that looked like an insurance company from the outside, because it was an insurance company from the outside, and went through the drive's documentation with 2 authentication specialists and a federal prosecutor named Lee Okafor, who asked questions in a rapid, precise sequence that felt more like surgery than interview. Petra had maintained chain of custody documentation on the drive. Every transfer, every access date, the original acquisition circumstances, the encryption log. She'd kept it the way she'd kept everything, systematically, without drama, because she'd been trained to understand that documentation without provenance was just data, and data without provenance was just noise. Okafor read through it without comment for 11 minutes. Then she looked up. "This is clean," she said. "I know," Petra said. "The Castle connection to Aldridge's closure signature. This establishes a direct relationship between the protected contractor network and a law enforcement officer who is currently serving in a position of direct authority over an active scheme." Okafor set the documents down. "This is not a local corruption case." "I know that too," Petra said. "Ms. Voss." Okafor paused in a way that suggested she was choosing words carefully. "What you preserved here, and the way you preserved it, it's going to be the structural spine of this prosecution. The financial records from Sandra Coppa, the video, the other employees' testimonies, those are the body. But without this," she gestured at the drive documentation, "we have a local scandal. With this, we have a federal case with reach that goes beyond Harwick." "How far beyond?" Petra said. "We're already cross-referencing Crane's network against active investigations in 2 other states." Okafor looked at her steadily. "This is going to take time to fully prosecute. I need you to understand that." "I understand that justice takes longer than injustice," Petra said. "I've had 4 years to get used to it." Okafor held her gaze for a beat. Then she nodded once, returned to her documents, and continued. At 5:15, Declan knocked on the frame of the open doorway and looked at Petra with an expression that wasn't quite his professional neutrality anymore. "Holt and Rourke have been placed on administrative suspension pending investigation," he said. "The suspension order came from the deputy commissioner, who is distancing himself from Aldridge's operation quickly." "How quickly?" "He was on the phone with our office within 40 minutes of us serving the warrant at the hotel." Declan's tone was dry without quite being judgmental. "Institutional self-preservation moves at a reliable speed." Petra thought about Elaine looking away, about all the speeds at which people moved when the structure around them started to shift. "Sandra Coppa," she said. "Protected. She's been formally interviewed and her material has been entered into evidence. He paused. "She cried in the interview room. Not breakdown crying. The other kind." Petra knew what the other kind was. She'd been in rooms where it happened. The specific release of someone who has been holding something alone for a very long time and has finally been allowed to put it down. "What about the patients?" she said. "The ICU patients COPI flagged. Independent Clinical Review Board is being assembled. Given the potential medical harm involved, the Federal Health Agency is treating it as priority." He paused. "That's going to be complicated. The medical implications, the long-term effects on patients who were kept on those protocols." "I know," she said. "Make sure the review board includes people who actually work in ICUs, not administrators." He looked at her. "I'll pass that along." She nodded. She was tired. Not the tired that came from a bad night, but the specific bone-level exhaustion of a day that had required her to operate continuously at a level she hadn't been asked to operate at since the service. Her temple throbbed. Her left shoulder, where an old injury from the extraction had never fully resolved, was sending signals she'd been ignoring for 6 hours. She stood up from the chair and felt the protest from every part of her body that had been pretending not to exist all day. "Is there somewhere I can—" she started. "Conference room B," Declan said. "There's a couch. It's not a great couch." "I don't need a great couch," she said. She'd been in the conference room for approximately 20 minutes, almost but not quite asleep, when Renata appeared in the doorway. Petra looked up. Renata's face had the quality of controlled agitation. Something was moving fast and Renata was running beside it rather than ahead of it. "What happened?" Petra said. "Crane is talking," Renata said. "He's been in federal custody for 4 hours and he's already asked for a cooperation discussion." She paused. "Which is fast. Usually they make us wait." "What's he offering?" "He's offering names, multiple states. multiple operational nodes. Apparently the Harwick scheme is a template. It's been run, or a version of it has been run, in 4 other cities. Renata came fully into the room. The federal prosecutor handling his custody just called Okafor. Crane is specifically asking about available protections in exchange for full disclosure on the network. She looked at Petra directly. He's also asking about you. Petra went still. What about me? He wants to know what you have. Not officially, informally, through his attorney. Renata's voice was careful. He's asking whether there's room in the cooperation discussion for a conversation about the castle documentation specifically. He wants to know if my drive can be used against him, Petra said. He wants to know if he can get ahead of it. Renata held her gaze. Okafor's position is that it can be used and will be used. His cooperation offer doesn't change what's already authenticated. She paused. But Petra, if he does cooperate fully, if he provides the network map and the names in the other states, the scope of this— I know what the scope means, Petra said. It means this goes somewhere instead of stopping here. She thought about that. Let him cooperate. Make sure the castle documentation stays in the record regardless of what he offers. And make sure the patients come first in the sequencing, the medical review, the civil rights violations, the forced treatment scheme. That doesn't get buried under the bigger case. Okafor has it flagged, Renata said. She's thorough. Good. Renata lingered in the doorway. There was something she hadn't said yet. What? Petra said. There's a reporter, Renata said. Not the local ones. National. She's been working a healthcare fraud investigative series for 8 months, and her editor called Okafor's office 20 minutes ago. Apparently she's been developing parallel sourcing on the Calverton network, and when the warrant service hit the news, she stopped. She's asking for Petra Voss. Petra looked at the ceiling for a moment. Not tonight, she said. She's going to run the story regardless, Renata said. The only question is whether your voice is in it. She can run it, Petra said. My voice can wait until I've slept and I know what I can say without compromising the case. She paused. Tell her I'm aware of her request. Tell her I'll be in contact. Renata nodded. She started to leave. Renata, Petra said. Renata stopped. The extraction case. Petra looked at her. Castle. All those years ago, did you— She stopped, found the actual question. Did you know the investigation was going to get closed the second time? Renata was quiet for a moment. She looked like someone deciding how much honesty a situation could hold. I suspected it, she said. The supervisory chain around the second closure was— I knew Aldridge's name from another context. A different theater, a different procurement concern. I couldn't prove a connection, and by the time I was building a file, the orders came through to stand down. She paused. I kept looking for it through other channels, for years. She met Petra's eyes, which is how I ended up in a position where I could answer a phone call from you at midnight and be in Harwick 2 hours later. You've been looking for the same thing, Petra said, from a different direction. They looked at each other. 4 years of maintained contact through a single saved number. 4 years of parallel motion toward the same point from different angles. It should have been a satisfying symmetry. Mostly it was just exhausting in the way that long-running things are exhausting when they finally arrive. Get some sleep, Renata said. Tomorrow is going to be complicated. She left. Petra lay back on the conference room couch. Declan had been right. It wasn't a great couch. And looked at the ceiling and listened to the building around her. The hum of servers. The muffled conversation of people working in other rooms. The particular focused industry of a federal operation in acceleration. Her shoulders sent another signal. She acknowledged it without doing anything about it. She thought about Tobias Annan pressing record on instinct. She thought about Sandra Coppa taping a USB stick inside a cookbook. She thought about Curtis Dial living in a different state for 8 months because they'd threatened his family. She thought about 43 patients on an ICU floor and what the clinical review board was going to find when they opened those records, and what that finding was going to feel like for the families who hadn't known. She was almost asleep when her phone buzzed. Not a call. A text from a number she didn't recognize. She looked at it. You don't know me. My name is Adele Tran. I work in the Calverton Health System's legal department. I have something you need to see. Not the billing records. Something different. Something that nobody knows exists except me and one other person. That person was in the hospital the morning you were arrested." Petra sat up. "The man in Tobias Anand's photograph," the text continued. "Crane wasn't planting evidence in the pharmacy. She stared at the screen. He was removing it. She read the text 3 times, not because she didn't understand it the first time, but because the implications of it shifted slightly with each reading, and she wanted to be sure she'd caught all of them before she moved. Crane hadn't been planting evidence. He'd been removing it, which meant there was something in that pharmacy corridor that predated the fabricated arrest, something that hadn't been manufactured for her specifically, something that had existed before she became the target, something that, if it had stayed in place, would have been discoverable by anyone looking at Harwick General's pharmaceutical operations with enough authority to look properly. She was off the couch and in the corridor in under a minute, phone in hand, knocking on the door of the room where she'd last seen Declan. He opened it with the expression of someone who hadn't slept either and was running on the particular fuel of a case that was breaking faster than his infrastructure could process. She showed him the text without explanation. He read it again. "Who is Adele Tran?" he said. "Calverton Legal Department." "I don't know beyond that." He was already moving, already pulling up his laptop. "How did she get your number?" "I don't know." Petra thought about it. "Web. If she went through official channels." "She didn't go through official channels," Declan said, still typing. "She texted you at..." He checked the timestamp. 10:43 p.m. on a personal number that is not publicly listed. He looked up. "She has access to something that gave her your contact information." "Calverton's HR system has my emergency contact number," Petra said, "which is a different number. But if she's in their legal department and she has access to the HR database, she'd also have access to the employment file that was used to build the case against you," Declan finished. He turned back to the screen. "I'm running her now. Give me 4 minutes." Petra waited in the doorway. Down the corridor, through a glass partition, she could see 2 people she didn't know working at computers with the specific posture of people in the middle of something that required complete attention. The building had a different quality now than it had at 5 p.m. Quieter, but more concentrated, the way a hospital gets at 2 a.m. when the volume drops but the stakes don't. "Adele Tran," Declan said. 38, Calverton Legal Department, 7 years. Before that, pharmaceutical regulatory compliance at a firm that was acquired by a larger network in..." He stopped, his hand slowed on the keys. "The firm that was acquired. One of the acquiring entities had Victor Crane on its board." Petra absorbed this. "She's not external to this," she said. "She may not know how deep she's in it," Declan said. 7 years ago, she takes a legal job at a healthcare company. The corporate lineage of that company connects to Crane, but that's not visible from where she'd be sitting." He looked up. "She might have come in clean and spent years gradually understanding what she was working inside. Like Sandra Koppa. Like the woman in the gray blazer who had tried the internal complaint process and watched it go nowhere." "The one other person she mentioned," Petra said. "The one who knows about whatever was in the pharmacy. The person who was there when Crane removed it." She looked at Declan. "That's not Crane. Crane was caught on camera with a second man. The second man's face wasn't clear enough to identify." Declan was already pulling up the photograph Tobias Anand had sent. "We've had the image enhancement running for 6 hours," he said. "The second man..." He turned the laptop so she could see the screen. The image was sharper than it had been on her phone. The second figure was still partially turned, but the enhancement had clarified the jaw angle, the shoulder line, the particular cut of a jacket that was slightly too formal for the role of someone walking into a hospital service corridor. She didn't recognize the face, but Declan's expression told her he did. "Howard Leite," he said. "Sandra Koppa's direct supervisor, the man who closed her internal complaint without a formal response." The architecture of it clicked into place with the particular clean sound of things that have been moving toward each other for a long time finally making contact. Leite hadn't just buried Koppa's complaint. He'd been an active participant. He'd been in that corridor with Crane, which meant whatever they'd removed from the pharmacy wasn't just incidental. It was something Late had known about, had helped maintain, and had helped eliminate when the operation required it. Okafor needs to know this tonight, Petra said. I'm already typing, Declan said. She texted it Adele Tron back, short, direct. I need to meet with you, not tomorrow. Now if possible. Tell me where you are. The response came in 40 seconds, which meant Adele had been sitting with her phone waiting. I'm at the Calverton offices. I haven't gone home. I've been here since they started arresting people. I have a physical file. Paper. I made it paper specifically because I was afraid of the digital system. Smart, Petra thought. Scared, but smart. Stay there, she typed. Someone is coming. Not police. Not hospital. Her name is Renata. She'll identify herself with the word castle. Don't give the file to anyone else. Renata moved. Petra didn't go with her, which was the right operational call even though it cost her. She was the one with the federal authentication already established. She was the one Okafor trusted, and she needed to stay accessible to the legal process that was running fast and needed her at every pivot. She sat back down in the conference room with its mediocre couch and waited, which was its own particular discipline. The night did what nights do in the middle of large events. It contracted into a series of small procedural moments that felt inadequate to the size of what they were processing. More calls, more documentation. Lee Okafor appeared at midnight to review the Leyte connection and departed 20 minutes later with the expression of a prosecutor who has just added a significant charge to an already significant indictment. At 1:30 a.m., Renata called. The file is real, she said. Petra could hear the control in her voice, the deliberate steadiness of someone conveying information that is larger than the professional frame it's being delivered in. Adele Tran has been quietly documenting a separate arm of the scheme for 11 months. Not the billing fraud. That's COPPA's territory. This is supply chain. Specific pharmaceutical products being diverted from Calverton's inventory through a logistics contractor and replaced with… She paused. With what? Petra said. Substandard substitutes. In some cases, placebos. Specific drug classes, pain management, sedation, neurological maintenance. Another pause. ICU patients, Petra. Patients whose families weren't monitoring their care closely. The real medications were being diverted to a secondary market. The patients were receiving… She stopped, found steady ground again. The Clinical Review Board is going to find that patients were undertreated or improperly treated. The financial scheme was just the surface. The actual harm is medical, Petra said. Yes. She sat with that for a moment. 43 patients. The number had been COPPA's estimate based on billing anomalies. The real number, once the clinical review ran, was going to be different, probably larger. How is Adele? She said. Shaking but functional, Renata said. She's been carrying this for nearly a year. She's relieved and terrified in equal measure, which is about right. Make sure she has legal representation before morning. Independent, not Calverton affiliated. Already arranged. Petra ended the call and looked at the wall of the conference room for a long moment. She thought about the people who had built this, not as a monolith, but as a collection of individual decisions. Aldridge signing his name to an investigation closure because Crane made it worth his while. Late accepting the role of operational point of contact inside the hospital because the money was sufficient and the risk felt managed. Holt and Rourke as the enforcement layer, doing what institutional muscle does when the institution has been corrupted from above. Each person adding their piece without necessarily seeing the whole, or choosing not to see it, which was worse. And beneath all of it, patients in beds who had no idea. The morning came faster than she expected, the way mornings do when you haven't slept properly. At 7:15, Lee Okafor assembled a short briefing for the people in the building who needed to understand what the next 12 hours were going to look like. Petra was included. She sat at the end of the conference table and listened and tracked the scope of what was unfolding with the specific attention of someone who has been inside an event from its beginning and is now watching it from the outside of itself. Howard Leyte had been picked up at 6 a.m. He'd been at home, not fleeing, apparently not aware yet that the photograph had been enhanced, apparently still believing that his morning would be ordinary. He'd asked for a lawyer before the federal agents had finished introducing themselves, which was smart, But the timing of the request in relation to the photograph enhancement result was, as Okafor put it, with professional understatement, not helpful to his position. Aldridge, who had been released the previous evening with his private attorney after the initial warrant service, had been formally taken into custody at 5:45 a.m. The deputy commissioner who'd called Declan's office within 40 minutes of the warrant service was now cooperating with a specific enthusiasm that Declan described as vigorous. Rourke had retained counsel. Holt had retained counsel, and within 2 hours of his attorney arriving, had requested a cooperation discussion, making him the second person in 20 hours to ask about cooperation, following Crane. "They're moving fast because they're afraid of being last," Okafor said, without particular satisfaction. "Each cooperation offer is worth less than the one before it. They all know that." "What does that mean for Aldridge?" Webb asked. He'd arrived at 7 a.m. in a clean shirt that suggested he'd gone home briefly, which Petra had not. "It means his window for a cooperation benefit is closing," Okafor said. "His attorney knows that. Aldridge knows that. Whether he acts on it before we don't need what he has anymore is—" She looked at her watch. "A question that will probably resolve before noon." After the briefing, Declan found Petra in the corridor. "I need to ask you something," he said. "Not for the record. Just, I want to understand something." She looked at him. "Ask." "The drive. 4 years. You maintained it, protected it, kept it documented and encrypted and accessible." He paused. "And you never tried to use it. Not once in 4 years did you bring it to anyone." "I didn't have the right connection," she said. "The people I would have brought it to were in institutional structures that had already demonstrated they could close investigations. Going back through the same architecture," she stopped. "You don't bring a key to the people who locked the door. So you waited." "I stayed ready," she said. "That's different." He held that for a moment. "When Rourke came into that ER, when they arrested you, did you know then?" "No," she said. "I suspected something was wrong. I didn't know what I was connected to until I heard Aldridge's name in that interview room." She paused. "And even then it took me until midnight to let myself believe it was really the same thread." "Why?" She thought about it honestly. Because the alternative, believing it was connected, believing it was this, meant accepting that it was going to get very bad before it got better. And some part of me wanted to be wrong about that. Declan nodded slowly. It was the nod of someone who recognized the shape of that experience. Her phone buzzed. Webb, with a message that contained a link and the words, "Watch this, then call me." It was a press conference. Not a local one, a federal one, held at a podium with a seal she recognized, with Okafor standing to the left of a senior official who was reading from a statement. The statement named Aldridge. It named Crane. It named Calverton Health Systems. It named the patient harm. It named the multi-state network. It named Petra Voss as the individual whose preservation of evidentiary documentation had made the investigation possible. She watched it on her phone in the corridor of a building that looked like an insurance company, still wearing yesterday's clothes, with a bruise fading on her temple and a shoulder that needed proper treatment, and 43 patients on an ICU floor whose families were going to start getting calls this morning from a clinical review board. She turned off the screen. It wasn't satisfaction, exactly. It was something quieter and more specific. The feeling of a weight that has been carried for a long time, being set down not because the terrain became easier, but because the destination had finally arrived. It was also, underneath that, something harder and less comfortable. The knowledge that the harm had happened. The patients. The years. The people like Daria Flood, who'd been ground through the machinery before anyone had the documentation to stop it. She called Webb. "The charges against you have been formally withdrawn," he said before she could speak. "As of 40 minutes ago. The records will reflect the withdrawal." He paused. "How are you?" "Working on it," she said. "That's honest." He was quiet for a second. "There are 4 reporters outside this building. That's going to get worse." "I know." "Okafor's office wants a formal statement from you this afternoon. Nothing extensive. Just—" "I'll be there," she said. She ended the call and stood in the corridor for a moment, just breathing. In 4 counts, out 4 counts, the old rhythm. Then her phone buzzed one more time. A different number. One she knew. The Harwick General Hospital main line. She looked at it for 3 seconds before answering. The voice on the other end was not Elaine. It was a man she didn't recognize, careful, administrative, apologetic in the specific way of someone who has been handed a very uncomfortable task by people above them. "Ms. Voss," he said, "I'm calling on behalf of the Harwick General Executive Committee. In light of the developments of the past 24 hours, we want you to know that your suspension has been immediately reversed and your position is fully reinstated." He paused. "Additionally, the committee has asked me to convey that—" Another pause. A slight rustle of paper, as though he was reading something he wished he'd written more smoothly. "We are prepared to make a formal public statement acknowledging that the actions taken against you were improper and that your record with this institution is without any adverse notation." She waited. "Ms. Voss," he said, "are you there?" "I'm here," she said. Do you have a response?" She thought about the main corridor at Harwick General. The walk from Bay 4 to the parking lot, the waiting room full of people watching, the volunteer at the information kiosk who had stood up to see better. "Tell the executive committee I'll be in contact through my attorney," she said, "and tell them that a formal public statement is a beginning, not an ending." She paused. "The patients need to be the first sentence of whatever they say. Not my record. The patients." A short silence. "I'll relay that," he said. She hung up. Down the corridor, Declan was emerging from a room with 2 other people in the expression of someone who had just received news that required immediate processing. He looked at her across the distance between them, and she recognized something in his expression. Not triumph, not relief. Something more serious. He walked toward her. "The clinical review board started their preliminary sweep of the ICU records at 6 this morning," he said when he reached her. "They've identified 31 cases that need urgent reevaluation." He stopped. "Petra, 6 of those patients are still in the ICU." She looked at him. "Still on the compromised protocols," he said. "As of this morning." Everything that had settled in the last hour, the press conference, the charge withdrawal, the hospital's apologetic phone call, moved aside for something that was older and more fundamental than any of it. Something that had been her entire professional formation before any of this started. "They need actual medications," she said. "They need a clinical team that knows what they were actually receiving versus what was charted, and they need it recalibrated immediately, not after the legal process, not after the administrative review. Now." She was already moving. "Where's the review board lead?" "Petra, you're not—" "I'm a registered nurse with an active license, a reinstated position, and 6 years of combat medicine including pharmaceutical improvisation in field conditions," she said without stopping. "Where is the review board lead?" Declan said nothing for a half second. Then he said, "Room 7," and she was already there. The review board's lead physician, a woman named Dr. Marguerite Voss, who had been pulled from a hospital in the next city at 5 a.m., looked up when Petra entered. She was 55, tired, wearing the expression of someone who had been looking at records for 2 hours and didn't like what she was finding. "You're Voss," she said. "Yes," Petra said. "I know who you are." Dr. Voss looked at her steadily. "I have 6 patients. I have incomplete records because someone removed materials from the pharmacy documentation. We're working from what copies photographs captured and what the billing records imply, but I'm missing actual administration logs for 3 of the cases." She paused. "I understand you have a background in field medicine." "Yes." "I need someone who can work with incomplete information and doesn't freeze when the data isn't clean." Dr. Voss held her gaze. "Are you available?" "Yes," Petra said. They went to work. It was not elegant. It was not the kind of medicine that looked good in a press conference statement or a hospital dedication speech. It was the particular messy, high-stakes work of reconstructing a pharmacological picture from partial records, cross-referencing known compound interactions against probable substitution products, building clinical hypotheses from the gaps in documentation and the physiological presentations of patients who couldn't speak for themselves. It was the kind of work that Petra had done in field conditions with worse equipment and better training than anyone in this building knew she had. She was 4 hours in, at a workstation in a temporary space the review team had established, when Dr. Voss set a hand briefly on her shoulder and said, "The third patient, your calculation on the sedation substitution. That's what we've been missing." The attending thought it was a medication reaction. It wasn't. Petra looked at the screen. The numbers were clear once you knew what you were looking at. "It's a dosing gap," she said. "The substitute compound has a different half-life than the charted medication. The patient's been in a cycle of partial undersedation that presents as a condition requiring more intervention," Dr. Voss finished, "which generates more billable treatment." She looked at Petra. "You caught this in 40 minutes. We've been looking at this patient for 2 hours." Petra didn't respond to that. She was already looking at the fourth case. She was aware, in the part of her mind that was running parallel to the clinical work, that the day outside this room was continuing to generate consequences. Arrests, statements, press conferences, legal filings. The cascading institutional reactions of a system discovering that one of its structural elements had just been removed. She was aware that her name was in all of it, that the video had crossed 2 million views overnight, that she was going to need to make decisions soon about what she said publicly and to whom. None of that was in front of her right now. In front of her were numbers and a patient who needed those numbers to be right. She kept working. At 11:30, her phone buzzed with a text from Renata. No message, just a news link. She clicked it. The headline was 4 words: "Aldridge agrees to cooperate." Below it, a photograph taken outside the federal building. Aldridge in a dark coat, his attorney beside him. The particular expression of a man walking out of one kind of institution and into another. He looked smaller than his office had made him. He looked like what he was, a 62-year-old man whose architecture had just collapsed and who was trying to negotiate the terms of the rubble. She set the phone down and returned to the fourth patient's records. Holt filed for cooperation by noon. Leite's attorney entered a cooperation discussion request at 12:47 p.m. The deputy commissioner issued a public statement at 1:15 naming Aldridge, naming Crane, naming the operational structure, and using the word systemic twice, which was the word institutional self-preservation used when it wanted to distinguish itself from the thing it had been sitting adjacent to. Petra was not in the room for any of it. She was in the temporary clinical workspace with Dr. Voss and 2 other physicians doing the thing she had trained to do before any of the rest of this existed, working the problem in front of her with the information she had, filling the gaps with experience, refusing to let incomplete data become an excuse for inaction. At 2:30 p.m., Dr. Voss looked up from the 6th patient's revised care plan and said quietly, "I think we have them. All 6 patients. Viable paths to proper treatment. Evidence-based corrected protocols, referrals to 3 independent specialists for the cases requiring extended oversight." Petra sat back in the chair. Her shoulder was genuinely painful now. She'd been using her right arm to favor it, and the compensation was showing up in her neck. She needed food, sleep, and probably an X-ray, in some order. "Good work," Dr. Voss said. It was a simple sentence. It wasn't a ceremony or a vindication or a formal acknowledgement in front of cameras. It was one physician saying it to another in a room where the work had just been done. Petra looked at her and thought about how long it had been since someone in medicine had said those words to her without an agenda attached to them. "Thank you," she said. "You too." She stood up, steadied herself against the brief vertigo of moving after hours of stillness, and picked up her phone. There were 17 missed calls, 4 from Webb, 2 from Renata, 1 from a number she didn't recognize that turned out, when she looked it up, to be the regional director of the Federal Healthcare Accountability Division, and 1, at the bottom of the list, from Elaine. She looked at that one for a long moment. Then she put the phone in her pocket and walked out of the room, down the corridor, and out of the building into the afternoon. The city was still there, going about itself in the ordinary, indifferent way cities have. Traffic, foot traffic, a kid on a bike. The particular quality of midday light in a city that has no idea it looks beautiful. She stood on the sidewalk and breathed, then she called Elaine back. It rang twice. "Petra," Elaine said. Her voice had a texture that wasn't administrative. It was something older and more human than that. "Elaine," Petra said. A long pause. "I looked away," Elaine said. "I know. I've been trying to—" She stopped. There's nothing I can say that... You're right, Petra said. There isn't. She paused. But I'm calling you back. That's what I can tell you right now. Silence on the line. The patients, Petra said. The 6 in the ICU. They're being properly treated now. That's what matters today. Another silence. Then Elaine said, in a voice that was doing a significant amount of structural work to hold itself together, Are you coming back? To the hospital? Are you... I don't know yet, Petra said honestly. I understand. She stood on the sidewalk a moment longer. She was about to hang up when her phone buzzed with a second call trying to come through. Webb, again, with the particular persistence of a man who has new information and considers it urgent. She switched over. The Federal Regional Director, Webb said immediately. She's been trying to reach you. She wants to discuss something before it goes to the press. He paused. She used the phrase national initiative and your name in the same sentence. Petra looked at the street. What kind of initiative? She said. Patient protection, Webb said. Healthcare worker protection. Specifically, he paused, and she could hear him reading from something. A proposed federal framework for investigating corruption at the intersection of law enforcement and hospital administration networks with a medical ethics oversight component. Another pause. She wants to talk to you about leading it. The afternoon traffic moved. Somewhere down the block, someone was playing music. Her shoulder ached. Tell her I'll call her tomorrow, Petra said. She said, Tomorrow, Petra said. I have something to take care of first. She hung up, stood on the sidewalk for 3 more seconds, and then did what she'd been doing all day. She moved toward the next thing that needed doing, with the particular forward momentum of someone who has learned that the work doesn't end just because the crisis does. But this time, for the first time in 36 hours, she chose the direction herself. The thing she needed to take care of was a storage unit on the north side of Harwick. She took a cab. Not because she couldn't call Renata or Declan or any of the people who had been moving mountains on her behalf for the last 36 hours, but because this particular errand didn't belong to any of them. It belonged to her, and to the version of herself that had rented this unit 7 years ago under a different name and never told anyone it existed. The unit was small, a 5x8, the kind that costs $40 a month and holds the things people aren't ready to throw away. The padlock was stiff from disuse. She worked it open and pulled the metal door up and stood in the entrance looking at what was inside. A footlocker, 2 cardboard boxes, a folded uniform she hadn't touched since she'd folded it the last time. She opened the footlocker. Underneath a field manual and a worn pair of gloves, there was a photograph she'd been carrying in her mind for 4 years without looking at directly. 6 people in military gear, somewhere hot and flat, squinting into the sun. 4 of them were still alive. 2 of them were not, and their absence was the reason she'd documented everything, the reason she'd kept the drive, the reason she'd made the decision she'd made about what kind of person she was going to be when she came back from that place. She looked at the photograph for a long time. Then she put it in her pocket. She locked the unit and didn't go back. The sentencing came in waves over the following weeks, public and procedural, and entirely without the dramatic compression that the events preceding them had carried. Aldridge received 12 years on federal charges covering corruption, conspiracy, civil rights violations, and obstruction. His cooperation had reduced what Okafor had said would have been closer to 20, but 12 was 12. And the man who had signed his name to investigation closures and called in favors across 2 decades walked into a federal facility on a Tuesday morning in the same unremarkable way he'd done everything else, quietly, having calculated that this was the best available outcome. Crane received 17. His cooperation had mapped the network across 4 states and produced 11 additional indictments, which the federal prosecutor described as significant. What it didn't do was change what he'd built or repair the years it had operated. He got 17 years and the network got dismantled. And somewhere in the math of that, Petra made her peace with the arithmetic because the alternative was carrying resentment about numbers. And she'd already spent enough time carrying things she hadn't chosen. Rourke got 8. Holt got 6 with a cooperation reduction that Webb called aggressive but not unjustifiable. Late got 9. The Calverton Health Systems executives who'd sat at the top of the billing scheme received sentences ranging from 4 to 11 years, along with civil liability judgments that stripped the company's Harwick operations down to the structural frame. The clinical review of the 43 flagged patients was completed over 6 weeks. 31 required amended care plans. 14 families filed civil suits. 4 patients had experienced measurable harm that would require ongoing treatment. No one had died directly as a result of the substitution scheme, a fact that the review board's lead physician described not as luck, but as the consequence of Sandra Koppa's billing anomaly documentation surfacing when it did, because another quarter in the picture would have looked different. Daria Flood's wrongful termination case was settled within 3 weeks of the indictments, in her favor, with a number her attorney described as appropriate. She called Petra once, briefly, to say thank you. Petra told her she'd done her own surviving long before any of this. There was a silence on the line that held more than either of them had language for, and then they said goodbye. Curtis Dial came back to Harwick. He didn't come back to Calverton. He took a position at a different hospital, independent, with a pharmacist licensing board that had been briefed on his circumstances. Petra heard this from Webb and thought about a man who'd spent 8 months living somewhere else because they'd threatened his family, and who'd come back anyway. That took a particular kind of courage that didn't make any news coverage. 3 months after the arrests, Petra walked back into Harwick General for the first time. She hadn't planned it as a significant event. She'd planned it as a practical matter. She needed to collect the personal items from her locker that had been held in administrative storage since her suspension, and she needed to sign paperwork formalizing the reinstatement that had been offered over the phone. Practical. Administrative. In and out. She knew before she pushed through the automatic doors that it wasn't going to be that. Elaine was waiting near the admissions desk, not positioned to intercept her, positioned uncertainly, like someone who'd decided to be there and then second-guessed the decision 3 times and stayed anyway. She looked like she'd slept badly for 3 months, which was probably accurate. "I didn't know if you'd want," Elaine started. "It's fine," Petra said. They walked together toward the staff corridor without much conversation, which was the right amount of conversation. Some things didn't benefit from being fully spoken. The looking away had happened. Elaine knew it. Petra knew it. The question wasn't whether it could be undone. It couldn't, but whether it defined everything that came after, and Petra had decided, somewhere in the quiet of the weeks since, that she wasn't interested in letting it. Not because it didn't matter, because she'd watched what happened when people let the worst moment of their own failure become the only thing they knew how to carry. And she didn't want that for Elaine, and she'd spent enough time around institutional collapse to understand that the people who looked away weren't always cowards. Sometimes they were just people who hadn't known what kind of moment they were in until it was already past. At her locker, number 14, second row from the left, she turned the combination and opened it, her spare set of scrubs. A small photograph she'd taped to the inside of the door years ago, creased now from the door closing and opening. A pen she'd been looking for. She took the photograph down and looked at it. 2 nurses from her first year at Harwick General, arms around each other, making faces at whoever was holding the camera. She'd forgotten about this photograph. She put it in her pocket with the other one. Behind her, the ER was doing what ERs do, moving, adjusting, the continuous low-grade controlled chaos of a place that doesn't stop regardless of what's happening in the larger world around it. She could hear monitors, a consultation happening in clipped clinical shorthand, someone asking for a portable X-ray. She closed the locker. Tobias Anand appeared in the corridor doorway. He was young enough that the months since the arrest had done something visible to him. He looked like someone who had crossed from one version of themselves into another and was still calibrating the new coordinates. He looked at her with the particular expression of a person who has done something significant and doesn't know yet how to carry it normally. "I heard you were coming in today," he said. "Word travels," she said. "I wanted to—" He stopped, started over. "I've been thinking about why I pressed record. In the moment, I didn't. It wasn't some decision I made. It was just, I saw something wrong, and my hands did something before my brain caught up." "That's how most of the right things happen," she said. He looked at her. Something settled in his face. "Are you coming back?" he said. She thought about the regional director's call, the national initiative, the framework that was being built for exactly the intersection of medicine and institutional corruption that had nearly taken her down, built partly because of what she'd preserved, partly because of what Sandra and Adele and Curtis had endured, partly because the sum of all of it had created enough political momentum to move something that would otherwise have stayed theoretical. It wasn't what she'd planned, but then none of this had been. "Not here," she said. "Not full time." She paused. "I'm going to be doing something else." He nodded slowly, absorbing that. "Good," he said, and she could tell he meant it. She walked out through the main corridor, the same one they'd walked her through in handcuffs, past the waiting room, past the admissions desk, past the information kiosk where the volunteer gave her a look of recognition that was warmer than a stranger had any reason to give. The automatic doors opened and she stepped out into the afternoon. The bruise on her temple was gone. Her shoulder had been properly treated, a minor ligament issue that a physiotherapist had described as chronically ignored, which was fair. She was wearing her own clothes, carrying her own bag, walking at her own pace toward a car where Renata was waiting, because Renata had said she needed a ride and Petra had said she didn't, and Renata had shown up anyway. She got in. Renata didn't say anything for a moment. She looked at Petra's face and read whatever was there, which was probably complicated. "How was it?" she said finally. Petra thought about the photograph in her pocket, about 6 patients with corrected care plans, about Adele Tran and her paper file hidden inside a cookbook, about a drive she'd carried for 4 years that was now in federal evidence, doing what it had always been meant to do. "Necessary," she said. Renata nodded and pulled into traffic. The city moved around them, ordinary, ongoing, full of institutions that mostly worked and some that didn't, and the continuous human effort of telling the difference. Petra looked out at it without bitterness and without the particular relief she'd expected to feel, because the truth was that vindication didn't feel the way people described it. It didn't feel like a door closing or a weight lifting or any of the clean metaphors that got used for it. It felt like arriving somewhere you'd been walking toward for a long time and finding that the arriving was not the end of walking, just the end of walking in that specific direction. The next direction was already visible. She thought about what the regional director had said: a framework, protection, something structural, built not for the people with the resources to fight, but for the nurses and pharmacists and compliance managers who filed complaints that got buried, who lost their positions to fabricated charges, who moved to other states because someone had threatened their families, and they hadn't known yet that their documentation was the key to a case that could bring the whole structure down. She hadn't survived war to be safe afterward. She'd survived it to know what survival was worth and what it was for. She reached into her pocket and held the photograph from the footlocker, the 6 of them, squinting into a sun that didn't exist anymore in a place she'd never go back to. She looked at the 2 faces that were absent now, and she thought about what they'd known and what they'd died for and what she owed them, not in grief, but in direction. She put the photograph away. "The regional director," she said. "I know," Renata said. "I'm going to call her tomorrow." "I know that too," Renata said. Outside, Harwick kept moving, a city that had tried to make her disappear quietly and had instead given her the exact coordinates of the work she was supposed to be doing. They'd seen a nurse. They'd forgotten everything else. She looked at the road ahead and felt, not triumph, but something more durable than triumph. The quiet, loaded certainty of a person who knows exactly who they are, what they carry, and what it's for. The drive had always been evidence, so had she.